We decided to go on a camping trip, my brother and I, to try and rekindle the bond that adult life had frayed. Jake and I were very close as kids, but routine and responsibilities had driven us apart. We found a remote spot in the forest, far from civilization, perfect for immersing ourselves in nature and childhood memories. We arrived early in the afternoon. The sun was still shining brightly, lighting the path to a clearing surrounded by tall trees. We set up our cabin with surprising efficiency, reminiscing about the times when camping was a regular holiday adventure. The smell of damp earth and the distant sound of a stream created an atmosphere of tranquility and nostalgia. As we prepared the campsite, we started talking about our lives, laughing about childhood pranks and lamenting lost moments. It was good to be there, away from the hustle and bustle of daily life, just me and Jake, like the old days. As night began to fall, we built a campfire and prepared for dinner. The flames and the soft light of the fire gave a cozy feel to the clearing, contrasting with the growing darkness of the forest around us. We were happy and relaxed, ready for a night of rest and good stories. Dinner was almost ready when we noticed something strange. There was movement outside the cabin, a shadow moving among the trees. Jake and I exchanged glances, immediately on alert. Whatever was out there made no noise except for the gentle rustling of leaves. "Did you see that?" Jake kept his eyes fixed in the direction of the shadow. We grabbed flashlights and, with the lights off, moved to the window. There, under the dim moonlight, we saw a man. He was carrying a large, seemingly heavy sack over his shoulders. The man seemed to be examining the cabin, as if deciding what to do next. What was he doing there? And what was inside that sack? Jake placed a hand on my shoulder, as if to reassure me, but I could feel the tension in his fingers. "Stay quiet. Let's observe a little longer." That stranger didn't seem to have seen us yet. We stayed there, motionless and silent, while he circled the clearing, stopping occasionally to look in our direction. Fear began to take hold of me, but I knew we needed to stay calm and think of a plan. After a few minutes, the man moved a little further away, disappearing among the trees, but the feeling of relief was brief. Whatever he was doing, it didn't seem like he was leaving anytime soon. We whispered, trying to decide what to do. The idea of going out and confronting him seemed dangerous, but staying there doing nothing wasn't an option either. Suddenly, we heard footsteps again, closer this time. Fear turned to panic. Jake grabbed a piece of wood, improvising a weapon. We decided that if he tried to enter the cabin, we would be ready to defend ourselves. The night turned into a tense vigil, every noise in the forest heightening our anxiety. The sound of footsteps and breaking branches around the cabin kept us constantly on edge. We didn't dare make a sound, fearing to attract the stranger's attention. The silence of the forest seemed to amplify his every move, and the darkness made everything even scarier. "Is he still there?" Jake looked out the window, his expression tense. "Yes, he's moving near the trees." We heard a loud noise, like something heavy falling to the ground. Our hearts almost jumped out of our chests. That man was definitely doing something we shouldn't witness. Jake signaled for me to stay calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "We need to get out of here, but we can't do it until dawn. He might be waiting for us outside." The idea of spending the entire night with that man lurking around the cabin was terrifying. Every second felt like an eternity. We stayed silent, listening to the sounds around us, trying to distinguish what was just the forest and what could be the stranger. At one point, we heard something even more disturbing, the sound of something being dragged. I could imagine the man pulling that heavy sack along the ground, and my mind started creating horrible scenarios about what could be inside it. What was he doing there? And why was he carrying that sack? The tension was palpable. We were trapped between the fear of acting and the terror of doing nothing. Jake suggested we arm ourselves with whatever we could find in the cabin. We grabbed kitchen knives and a piece of metal we used for the fire, ready to defend ourselves if the man tried to enter. The night passed in a blur of fear and anxiety. At every sound, our bodies tensed, prepared for the worst. We felt we weren't alone, that we were constantly being watched. Time seemed to drag on cruelly, and the only thing we could do was wait and pray that the man didn't do anything. The first rays of sunlight finally began to appear on the horizon, bringing a minimum of comfort. However, we were still on high alert. The silence that fell over the forest with the arrival of the day was almost as terrifying as the sounds of the previous night. Jake and I had barely slept, exhausted, but adrenaline kept us alert. I was looking out the window when I saw him again. The man was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, the large sack still hanging on his shoulders. He looked tired, but his eyes still shone with a disturbing intensity. The daylight revealed more details. His clothes were dirty and worn, and his face had a hard, impenetrable expression. Jake came over to me, also observing the sinister figure. "Let's wait for him to leave," he said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. The man stood there for a few more minutes, as if deciding his next steps. Then, without warning, he began to slowly move away, entering the dense forest. The tension in our bodies began to dissipate, but the fear was still present. When we were sure he had gone, we quickly started packing up the camp. We didn't exchange many words, both aware that we needed to leave as soon as possible. As we packed our things, the silence of the forest seemed to watch us, as if we were still being observed. As we walked back along the narrow trail, my heart was still pounding. What could have happened if he had decided to enter the cabin? What was in that sack? These questions kept echoing in my mind, unanswered. We reached the car and threw our things into the trunk, quickly getting in and locking the doors. The sound of the engine starting was a relief, a familiar sound amid the unknown. We drove in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, when we were at a safe distance, Jake broke the silence. "I'm never going back there. That was a nightmare. We never did go back. That wasn't a common area to have someone else, and that man's behavior was definitely not normal. Luckily, he never saw our faces. I'd live in fear if that had happened." It was the year 2016, and my wife, Laura, and I were eager to celebrate our 5th wedding anniversary in a different way. We decided to hike in a remote forest reserve in California. The idea of reconnecting far from the city's hustle and bustle, amidst the serenity of nature, seemed perfect. We chose a little-known path, an isolated trail that promised peace and tranquility, far from other hikers and tourists. Prepared with backpacks full of supplies and hearts full of excitement, we began our hike on a sunny morning. The forest around us was dense, with towering trees whose canopies formed a green arch above our heads. The sound of birds and the rustling of leaves accompanied us, creating a natural soundtrack that was both calming and invigorating. After a few hours of hiking, we found a small clearing perfect for setting up our camp. We decided to explore the area a bit more before setting up the tent. That's when we spotted the cabin. It looked old, perhaps built decades ago, but something about it caught our attention. The windows were broken, the wood aged and dark, but there was an air of mystery that intrigued us. We decided to take a closer look. "Shall we take a look?" I asked her with curiosity and apprehension. Laura agreed, and together, we headed to the cabin's entrance. The door was ajar, creaking slightly with the wind. Inside, the air was heavy and smelled musty. The daylight barely penetrated through the cracks in the walls and windows, creating long, dark shadows. We soon realized that despite its abandoned appearance, There were signs of recent occupation. A dirty mattress in a corner, empty food cans, and a fireplace with fresh ashes. This made us curious. Who would be living there, and why? Little did we know that this discovery would mark the beginning of a night we would never forget. As we explored the cabin, the feeling of being watched started to grow. Laura, always more intuitive than I, noticed it first. She said she thought it was better to go back to the camp, that something wasn't right. I agreed, sensing a strange atmosphere. We left the cabin and returned to the clearing where our things were. We tried to continue with our plans, setting up the tent and preparing dinner, but the unease didn't leave us. The sun began to set, the sky turning shades of orange and red. Around us, the forest plunged into darkness and seemed even denser than during the day. We lit a campfire to illuminate the night and bring some warmth and comfort. We were almost able to relax when we heard the first noise. It was a low sound, leaves rustling, which was normal for a forest, but it was as if someone was moving stealthily. We looked around but saw nothing. I tried to ignore it, thinking it could be a wild animal. But then the noises became more frequent and closer. "Did you hear that?" Laura asked. I said I did, trying to stay calm. It must be just an animal. However, we both knew there was something more. We decided to investigate. With flashlights in hand, we approached the cabin, from where the sounds seemed to be coming. The light from the flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and bushes, until we saw the lights. They were small points of light, like flashlights, moving among the trees, appearing and disappearing. Fear began to set in for real. Who was there, and why? Suddenly, the lights stopped moving. They stayed still, directed at us, as if their bearers had spotted us. The silence was dreadful, except for the sound of our own heartbeats. I tried not to panic and said we needed to leave immediately. But before we could take the first step back, one of the lights started to approach, slowly, as if they were testing us. We couldn't see who was holding the flashlight, we just felt the presence. Laura squeezed my hand tightly, and I knew we needed to act quickly. Even though we were very scared, we managed to run back to the camp. We extinguished the campfire and hid in the tent, hoping that whatever it was would lose interest. We heard the footsteps around us, the sound of leaves being trampled, and knew we were surrounded. The tent felt like a fragile shelter against whatever was out there, and the sound of footsteps circling around it only heightened our anxiety. We tried to keep our breathing quiet, but fear made our hearts beat so loud it seemed impossible they wouldn't hear. Then, something scratched the side of the tent. A long, tearing sound, like nails on fabric. Laura swallowed a scream, and I held her hand, trying to convey some courage. I didn't feel myself. The scratch was followed by a low whisper, a voice that seemed close, but we couldn't understand the words. It was a chilling sound, like someone trying to communicate with us from a nightmare. Suddenly, the tent was pulled from one side, moving violently. Laura couldn't hold back the scream this time. We jumped out of the tent, our flashlights trembling in our hands. Outside, everything was dark and silent again, but we knew they were close. The lights from the flashlights turned on again, closer than before, illuminating pale, expressionless faces emerging from the trees. There was no time to think. I grabbed Lara's hand and we started running down the trail back. The sound of footsteps behind us was terrifying, like a crowd chasing us. Adrenaline drove us, and we ran without looking back, dodging branches and rocks, fear guiding us through the darkness. We could hear voices now, whispers and low laughs echoing in the forest. It was like being trapped in a nightmare from which we couldn't wake up. With each step, we felt their presence getting closer, and the only thing we could do was keep running. Finally, we saw the entrance to the reserve, the faint light of a ranger's flashlight patrolling the area. We ran towards him, shouting for help. When we got close enough, he raised his flashlight, confused by our state. "What happened?" he asked. We told him everything, our words rushed by panic. The ranger immediately called for backup, and we were taken back to safety. We reported the incident to the authorities, but searches for the cabin and its inhabitants revealed nothing. The forest was deserted, with no signs of the people who had chased us. The episode left us deeply shaken, with many unanswered questions. Who were those people? Why did they chase us? And how did they disappear without a trace? We don't talk about it much with strangers, but we know what we saw that day. I've always been passionate about outdoor adventures. The sense of freedom that only nature can provide is something that has always attracted me. So, I decided it would be a good idea to spend 3 days in an isolated cabin in the forest, hiking daily and disconnecting from the urban world and its worries. The cabin was simple but cozy, located in the middle of the woods, a few kilometers from the nearest town. It promised tranquility and a certain isolation that, I confess, also enchanted me. I arrived there late in the morning, left my things in the cabin, and set out to explore the first trail. It was a peaceful path, surrounded by tall trees and the sound of birds that seemed to welcome me. The first day passed without incident. I returned to the cabin at the end of the afternoon, tired but satisfied. I prepared a simple meal and spent the night reading a book by lantern light. The peace I felt at that moment was indescribable. The silence of the forest, interrupted only by the occasional distant howl of some nocturnal animal, made me fall asleep quickly. On the second day, I woke up early and felt renewed. I prepared a quick breakfast and set out to explore a new trail. The hike was longer this time, the terrain a bit more rugged, but the beauty of the place made up for any effort. I spent hours walking, occasionally stopping to admire the view and take photos. I felt a deep connection with the nature around me. When I finally returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. That's when I noticed something strange. My belongings were not exactly as I had left them. The backpacks were out of place. Some food I had left on the table was now on the floor. Initially, I thought it might have been an animal, maybe a raccoon that entered while I was out. I closed the door and windows more securely before going to bed, trying not to give the occurrence much importance. On the third day, I decided to take the most challenging trail. I woke up even earlier, full of energy and enthusiasm. The trail was tough, but the feeling of accomplishment was gratifying. I spent the day immersed in the forest, just me and my thoughts. As the afternoon began to fade, I started the journey back. As I approached the cabin, I felt an inexplicable chill. Something wasn't right. The silence seemed heavy, oppressive. When I finally opened the door, horror took over me. 2 unknown men were inside, rummaging through my things. Fear gripped me in a way I had never felt before. They hadn't noticed me yet, so, with a racing heart and trying to make as little noise as possible, I backed away slowly and ran into the woods, looking for a hiding spot. Hidden among the trees, my mind was in a whirlwind. What were those men doing in my cabin? At first, I thought about confronting them, but fear quickly smothered any trace of courage. They could be armed. They could be dangerous. I remained still, controlling my breathing, alert to any movement or sound. Minutes turned into hours as I watched from a distance the intruders rummage through my belongings. They seemed to be looking for something specific, which only increased my unease. Night fell, and the darkness of the forest became my ally, hiding me as I tried to decide what to do. Suddenly, one of the men left the cabin, lighting a powerful flashlight. The beam of light swept the area around, and my heart nearly stopped when the beam passed dangerously close to where I was. The other man soon followed, both speaking in low voices, their dark silhouettes projected against the faint moonlight. They seemed frustrated. Maybe they hadn't found what they were looking for. My mind spun with questions and theories. What could be so important for someone to break into an isolated cabin in the middle of the forest? And why exactly mine? The men went back inside, and I continued to watch, fearing that at any moment they might discover me. Finally, after what seemed like endless hours of waiting, the men came out again, this time carrying bags. They walked in the opposite direction to mine, slowly disappearing into the darkness of the forest. I waited a while longer to make sure they wouldn't return, the tension in my body still pulsing strongly. When I was sure the men had really gone, I cautiously left my hiding spot. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified, a potential signal that they might be coming back. I remained alert, ready to hide again if necessary. When I reached the cabin, a sense of relief mixed with adrenaline washed over me. The interior was in complete chaos, my belongings scattered everywhere. I grabbed only the essentials, documents, some food and water, and my flashlight. The idea of spending another night there was inconceivable, so I decided to leave immediately. I walked through the forest under the faint light of the flashlight, following the path back to the town. Every snap of a twig and every distant sound made me jump with fear. Paranoia was at its peak, and I couldn't stop looking back, certain that at any moment, I would see those men again. It took hours to finally reach the edge of the forest. The sky was beginning to lighten, announcing dawn, when I saw the first house. With a sigh of relief, I quickened my pace and knocked on the door, quickly explaining my situation to the homeowner, who kindly offered help and called the authorities. I reported everything to the police, from the moment I noticed my belongings had been tampered with to the desperate escape. They promised to investigate and offered me temporary shelter until I could return to my own home. As I sat there, trying to process everything that had happened, I realized how close I had come to real danger. The forest, which initially promised peace and adventure, had turned into a scene of terror.